Okay, does this happen to anybody else? You sit down with a juicy QPC, some McNuggets, and those golden fries from McDonald's. Then you take a long sip of your Sprite because you can still hear your mama saying, "Don't fill up on that drink before you eat your food." But you're grown now, so you do what you want.
Share and share alike with the 20-piece McNuggets from McDonald's for just $6. Limited time only. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
For my family, I'm always at my best. That's why I also want the best in my kitchen. And that means only Eggland's Best Eggs. They're always so fresh tasting and delicious. With 6 times more vitamin D, 10 times more vitamin E, and 25% less saturated fat than ordinary eggs. So why give your family less when they can have the best? Eggland's Best. Better taste, better nutrition, better eggs. For added convenience, look for our hard-cooked peeled eggs.
Summer's heating up, and so is the action with Chumba Casino and 23XI Racing. Whether you're trackside with Bubba, Riley, and Tyler, or cooling off at home, the fun never stops at Chumba Casino. The online social casino packed with free-to-play games like slots, bingo, and more. Jump into summer at ChumbaCasino.com and score your free welcome bonus. 2 million free gold coins and 2 free sweeps coins. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See T&Cs. 21 plus. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
Reggie, I just sold my car online.
Let's go, Grandpa. Wait, you did?
Yep, on Carvana. Just put in the license plate, answered a few questions, got an offer in minutes. Easier than setting up that new digital picture frame.
You don't say.
Yeah, they're even picking it up tomorrow. Talk about fast.
Wow, way to go. So, about that picture frame.
Forget about it. Until Carvana makes one, I'm not interested.
Car selling made easy. On
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Across all mediums, books, television, podcasts, psychopaths continue to be a topic that captivates audiences. But Hollywood isn't the only institution interested in this community. Starting in the 1990s, America and Canada's judicial system heavily adopted the use of psychopathy assessments to identify psychopaths and inform legal decision-making.
The iteration of psychopathy assessments that we know today are these very structured interview protocols where you have a certain scoring mechanism where the clinician will sit down and eventually yield a score on the patient they're sitting with, and then that score will indicate whether they meet the clinical threshold of psychopathy.
That's Rasmus Larsen, a forensic epistemologist at the University of Toronto and author of Psychopathy Unmasked, The Rise and Fall of a Dangerous Diagnosis. He says there are a few main reasons why psychopathy assessments were implemented, one being that it's been thought this tool could predict which criminals would be high risk.
In other words, who are the individuals who will very likely recidivate if we give them parole, for example? Who are the individuals that we should put in high risk or maximum security institutions, and who can we give probation instead, for example? So there's been this need in the legal system to make those decisions always. And here comes along a tool that proclaims that it can help predicting who those individuals are.
Another reason why the system wants to identify psychopaths is because there's been a belief that these offenders can never be reformed.
They cannot be rehabilitated. They will never change. They will just stay dangerous and stay this extreme personality for the rest of their lives. And this plays into, this information is important in a legal context in all sorts of ways. For example, if you have gone through a rehabilitation program, should we now believe that the person has changed and become better, so to speak? Are they now of lower risk than previously? Now, if a person has this label been assessed with psychopathy, the inference that the legal system will make is that they have probably not changed.
What this expectation led to was these inmates not being allowed into rehabilitation programs because not only was it thought that it wouldn't help, but it would make them worse. So while scoring high on a psychopathy assessment isn't a crime, Larsen says it can heavily influence a person's sentencing.
Sentencing is not just this straightforward catalog you look up, what did people do, and then it equals a certain sentence. No, there's all sorts of flexibility. It's often referred to as sentencing guidelines. So a judge has a lot of discretion. And a person who is considered very high risk, it might get a different sentence for the same crime as a person who's considered low risk. So The way psychopathy assessments enters the picture here is that it generates information to decision makers.
At face value, if psychopaths are a danger to society and unable to be rehabilitated, it makes sense that these assessments should hold more weight for how they're sentenced. However, Larsen argues that much of these beliefs are based off studies from the 80s and 90s that have been disproven by newer research. The early studies promoted 5 basic principles of psychopathy, which include that these individuals are high risk, untreatable, lack remorse and empathy, and have distinct brain differences. However, Larsen says these principles have been exaggerated.
In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a lot of enthusiasm behind this research, and there was indeed also studies that seemed to suggest that all of these 5 claims have kind of been vindicated, if you will, empirically, right? What we have found out the last 10 to 15 years is very sobering. We have found out that that's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that we have really clear scientific evidence to support these 5 claims. So this is a development that has occurred in the research domain as these assessments were used in the legal system. So you could, if you want to be generous to the interpretation, you can say that in the 1990s and 2000s, it could, in some sense, be said that maybe there was some scientific evidence to suggest that it was a legitimate practice to use these psychopathy assessments. But when you stand from today's perspective in 2025, and also with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that the scientific evidence is just simply not there.
One example Larsen cites is the belief that people with psychopathy cannot be successfully treated. As we mentioned earlier, the fear was that any attempt to rehabilitate would actually make them worse.
Now, so the idea was that, or at least the myth, if you will, was that psychopaths are so cunning and so manipulative that if you enroll them in these rehabilitation programs, they somehow just like become better or more inclined to commit more crimes or something like that. I'm not saying it makes sense. This was just a myth that was out there.
Larsen says it stems from one study in 1992 that showed psychopathic individuals who received treatment also had higher rates of recidivism compared to those who didn't.
Today, we know that this study was not really a great study. It was based on some really problematic methods, including the type of treatment that was issued to these individuals, which actually a court in Canada ruled included torturing their patients. So they were kind of just, let's just say that maybe the reason why they were having higher recidivism rates were because they were being like maltreated in that program, right? So there's a long history behind that whole study and why we shouldn't believe it. And I don't think many people take it seriously today. That is virtually the only study we have that suggested something to that effect. But when you look at the research record in the past 20, 30 years, there's just overwhelming evidence that there's nothing unique about people with a high psychopathy score. They seem to react and respond to treatment efforts in exactly the same ways as your average high-risk individual would respond to it.
Despite these 5 foundational beliefs being largely debunked, the psychopathy assessments continue to hold a lot of weight in the legal system. There could be a successful argument for its influence if this method was proving to work at reducing crime. But Larsen says the results are hard to accurately measure.
If you really deem a person a high risk, like say an extraordinarily high risk individual, they will also be dealt with in a way that mimics that, meaning that you will often never really, like in a practical sense, figure out whether they truly were high risk because they will be in custody, right? So there's this self-fulfilling prophecy here. But the importance is that, to what we're talking about here, is that we can actually test it in different ways.
Psychologists have tested the actual risk profiles of people who have received high psychopathy scores and discovered that these individuals aren't as high risk as predicted.
We go into the judicial system and then we recruit a sample of, say, 500 people, and we issue a psychopathy assessment independently for our own research purposes to these 500 individuals. And then eventually, many of these individuals will be released from the correctional institution. And then we will track their future behavior, so to speak, if they end up back in the correctional facility, for example, what type of crime they ended up committing and so on. And what we find is that the correlation between a high psychopathy assessment score and future criminal behavior is not that strong.
In other words, being perceived as high risk based on this assessment doesn't line up with reality. The original criteria for this assessment to be used within the legal system was that it had to be evidence-based. But now that psychologists have proven the original evidence was faulty, why is it still such an influential tool?
So here you have the tension, right? People in the legal system think these scores are very predictive of risk, but in reality, we don't have evidence to suggest that that is actually the case, right? But the person is still being dealt with as if they are high risk, right? So this is the tension that we have. And this is the newfound evidence for the last 10, 15 years of research that we have found out as psychologists that, we might actually have generated an instrument that was initially thought to have these really profound capabilities of being able to predict something like high risk, where we're now finding out that that's not the case. So we psychologists are kind of screaming from the outside in to the legal system and say, hey, be careful with this instrument. But now it's kind of loose and it's hard to reel in, right? This is the problem we're finding ourselves in now.
The original criteria for this assessment to be used within the legal system was that it had to be evidence-based. But now that psychologists have proven the original evidence was faulty, why is it still such an influential tool?
Really, at the end of the day, it comes down to our legal system being this very imperfect entity, right? We would like it to function smoothly, and we would like decisions to be based like profoundly on something like empirical evidence, scientific evidence, right? It's just simply not the case. It has certainly become much better the past 100 years, but it's still not perfect. So practices in the legal system does not change as quickly as the scientific developments.
In his book, Larsen provides evidence against the 5 core beliefs of psychopathy, but then takes it a step further. With research unable to support the foundational aspects of this disorder, he questions if it's possible psychologists have been wrong about the entire diagnosis. It's a controversial question, but one that Larsen believes is worth exploring.
When somebody has an idea, a conviction of how the world is, and the empirical evidence does not support that conviction, at some point you have to ask yourself, is this because the idea itself is completely wrong-headed, right?
Holding on to these beliefs, even when the evidence isn't lining up, is a concept referred to as a zombie idea.
The idea is dead, but it's still walking around in academic circles and in scientific communities as if it's like a real solid thing you should go and investigate, right? So I'm not saying that there are, like, all human beings are just fine and dandy and nobody are evil and bad individuals. Of course not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the specific claims that are made about psychopathy, such as that these individuals have no capacity for empathy, they have no emotions, they are extremely impulsive, all these like really key psychological claims, I'm starting to wondering whether we are just misunderstanding what is going on.
But as researchers work to tease apart fact from fiction, the psychopathy assessments continue to carry a lot of influence across the legal system, something Larsen views as a great injustice.
It really is a profound challenge that we're standing in front of. And it also tells you a little bit about how big, not just how big the problem is, but also the scale of the injustice when you start thinking it through, because we're talking about hundreds of thousands of individuals in the US legal system alone who are impacted by these assessments for no evidence-based reasons.
Larsen's book, Psychopathy Unmasked, is available now wherever books are sold. You can find more information about Rasmus Larsen and all of our guests on our website, ingoodhealthpodcast.org. For more behind the scenes, follow In Good Health Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farrah. Our executive producer is Amira Zavari. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.
Okay, does this happen to anybody else? You sit down with a juicy QPC, some McNuggets, and those golden fries from McDonald's. Then you take a long sip of your Sprite because you can still hear your mama saying, don't fill up on that drink before you eat your food. But you're grown now, so you do what you want.
Share and share alike with the 20-piece McNuggets from McDonald's for just $6. Limited time only. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
For your tushy, it's made by angels. Soft and strong, budget friendly. The choice is simple. A roll that feels like paradise, and always at a heavenly price. Angel soft, soft and strong, so it's simple.
Pick up a pack today.
Angel Soft. Soft and strong, simple.